Hey everyone, I just want to take a moment to say how much I appreciate you listening and supporting The Last Trip. It truly means the world to me. I know this episode is coming to you a little late, and I want to apologize for that, and for the audio quality as well. For those who don't know, my mom was diagnosed with Parkinson's a few years ago, and recently her health took a turn for the worse. I've been with her at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota for the past couple of weeks, and finding time to work on the podcast has been a challenge. Right now, I'm recording this at 2 a.m. in a Super 8 motel, doing my best to get this episode out to you. It might not be perfect, but I hope you'll bear with me. Thank you for your patience and support. It truly means everything. All right, let's get into it. Ladies and gentlemen, the captain has turned on the fasten seatbelt sign. If you haven't already done so, please make sure the volume of this podcast is set perfectly to your listening enjoyment. Please take your seat, whether that's on the treadmill, car, sofa, or bed, and buckle in for the last trip. My name is Jamie Beebe, and I'll be your tour guide recreating someone's last days in paradise. On behalf of myself and everyone behind the scenes, please enjoy the Last Trip podcast. And because nobody likes a long flight to get to where they want to be, let's prepare for takeoff. Nine hikers set out on a journey across the frozen wilderness of the northern Ural Mountains in early 1959, but they never made it back. They were Igor Dyatlov, Yuri Doroshenko, Lyudmila Dubinina, who we'll call Lyudya, Georgiy Krivonishenko, who we'll call Yuri, Alexander Kolevatov, who we'll call Sasha, Zinaida Kolmogorova, who we'll call Zina, Rustem Slobodin, who we'll call Rustic, Nikolai Thibeaux-Brignolles, who we'll call Thibeaux, and Semyon Zolotaryov. And I probably butchered all of those names. What was meant to be a challenging yet rewarding skiing expedition turned into one of history's most chilling and perplexing mysteries. Their route took them through a remote stretch of the Ural Mountains, a place that would later be named Dyatlov Pass in honor of their ill-fated journey. This tragedy occurred over 60 years ago. Diaries and cameras recovered from their campsite have helped piece together their final days. The hikers trekked steadily through the harsh terrain, setting up camp for the night on February 1st. They had dinner, they wrote in their journals, they settled in to rest. Then, something happened. Something so terrifying that it drove them out of their tent into the freezing night, half-dressed, unprepared, and ultimately to their deaths. Their bodies were discovered weeks later, scattered across the snowy landscape, with injuries that only deepened the mystery. Over the years, countless theories have emerged, some grounded in science, others veering into the realm of the supernatural. But one question remains. What really happened to the Dyatlov Nine? Now, I have to be honest. If I were planning a trip, the Ural Mountains in Russia would not exactly be at the top of my list. I'm all about warm beaches, tropical breezes, and crystal clear oceans. But the Urals, they offer something completely different. A frozen, rugged, and ancient landscape that has fascinated explorers, scientists, and mystery seekers for centuries. The daily temperature in these mountains? A bone-chilling 5 degrees Fahrenheit on a good day. And in the dead of winter, it doesn't even break into positive numbers. The climate is relentless, frosty, unforgiving, and unpredictable. But these mountains are far from ordinary. Stretching over 1,500 miles from the icy Arctic Ocean in the north to the Ural River in the south, the Ural Mountains form a natural divide between Europe and Asia. They are among the oldest mountain ranges on Earth, dating back 250 to 300 million years to the Paleozoic era, when strange sea creatures still ruled the planet and dinosaurs hadn't even made an appearance yet. And they weren't just formed overnight. These mountains rose from a collision of continents when the Siberian and Kazakh tectonic plates smashed together, crumpling the Earth's crust like a sheet of paper. Now, that violent clash left behind a geological treasure trove: iron, copper, gold, silver, and even rare gemstones, which were extensively mined during the 18th and 19th centuries. Some of the world's finest emeralds and alexandrites were pulled from these ancient rocks. But this is not just a cold, desolate place. For thousands of years, the indigenous Mansi people have lived here, navigating the frozen terrain with an unmatched knowledge of the land. They have their own legends and spiritual connections to the mountains, some of which are eerily intertwined with the mystery we are about to explore. Settlements sprang up along the valleys and foothills, with the largest city in the region, Yekaterinburg, founded in 1723. This city holds its own dark history. It's the place where the last Russian Tsar, Nicholas II, and his family were executed in 1918. And during World War II, the Urals became crucial to the Soviet Union's survival. As Nazi forces pushed eastward, the Soviet relocated entire industries and factories to the mountains, hiding them from German invasion. The region became an industrial powerhouse, producing weapons, machinery, and supplies that helped turn the tide of the war. Today, the Ural Mountains are still mined for resources, but they've also become a destination for hikers, skiers, and thrill seekers, those who crave extreme conditions and untamed wilderness. But for 9 hikers in 1959, this was no adventure. It was their last trip, one that ended in mystery, terror, and unanswered questions. Who were the 9 young adventurers that set out into the frozen wilderness of the Ural Mountains in January 1959, only to vanish into legend? Their journey was supposed to be a test of endurance, a push toward their coveted Grade 3 hiking certification. Instead, it became one of the greatest unsolved mysteries of all time. Let's meet them. Igor Dyatlov was the expedition's beating heart. At just 23, he was already a name whispered with respect in the hiking community. A radio engineering student at Ural Polytechnic Institute, he didn't just love adventure, he thrived on it. He was meticulous, responsible, and an innovator, designing shortwave radios to take on hikes. He was also a gifted photographer, capturing moments that would soon turn eerie, the final images from their ill-fated trip. To his friends, he was a rock. To his team, he was their leader. And to history, he became a legend. The fearless one was Yuri Doroshenko. Some people run from danger, but Yuri, he ran at it. He was impulsive, courageous, some might even say reckless. At just 21, he was famous for an unforgettable story where he charged a massive bear with nothing but a geologist's hammer, sending the beast retreating into the forest. Tall, impulsive, and fiercely loyal, Yuri once had a romance with fellow hiker Zina. Even after it ended, the two remained close. Maybe too close for comfort. Maybe it was that fearlessness that led him into the snow that night, half-dressed, barefoot, fighting against something unseen. He once defied a bear and lived, but what did he face that night that even he couldn't conquer? The youngest of the group, at just 20, Lyudmila to her friends, was as tough as they came. So tough that on a previous hike, when a hunter accidentally shot her in the leg, she kept going, stubbornly limping back through the mountains rather than accept defeat. She was bright, full of life, and loved to sing. Her camera captured smiles and laughter just days before the horror unfolded. But when she was found, her injuries were some of the most disturbing. Something had stolen her voice, crushing her ribs with a force no human could wield. And then there was Georgiy Krivonishenko, who was always the one making people laugh. A joker, a musician, a storyteller. He was the soul of the group. Even in the bitter cold, he carried his mandolin, a piece of warmth in the icy wild. He was a trained engineer and a close friend of Igor's, having joined him on nearly every hike before this one. But laughter turned to screams that night. He and Yuri Doroshenko were found first, by the tree, stripped nearly bare, their hands burned. What were they trying to escape? What did they see that no one else did? Sasha was 24 and already a nuclear physics student, but his past? Well, that was layered in shadow. He was quiet, thoughtful, and intelligent, but he had a past that didn't quite add up. His father died mysteriously on a railway line. He had spent part of his childhood in Gulag, And his job in Moscow? It was well-paid, secretive, and possibly tied to classified research. Did he know something he shouldn't have? Was it a coincidence that his body was found with unexplained injuries? That his clothing bore traces of radiation? Or that his very presence on this hike remains one of the group's greatest mysteries? Zina wasn't just another hiker. She was a force of nature, the spark of the group. At 22, she had already led 2 expeditions and was an elected member of UPI's hiking club. She was outgoing, kind, and endlessly determined. She had a way of bringing people together. Zina had a reputation for being fearless, once refusing to drop any of her gear, even after being bitten by a venomous viper. Now, most would have turned back, but not her. She carried on, refusing to burden the others. It makes you wonder, when death came for her that night, did she fight just as hard? And was she the one who left behind a frantic, half-written message in the group's journal that simply said, "We now know snowmen exist"? And of course, the whispers of something more between her and Igor, unspoken, unconfirmed, but undeniably there. Rustic was a long-distance runner, an experienced hiker, and a man of few words. He was an athlete, strong, determined, and disciplined. At 23, he had the physical endurance to outlast almost anyone. He once hiked 300 kilometers through the Tian Shan Mountains with his father. It was hostile territory, where locals resented outsiders. But he survived. He had seen hardship before. He knew what it meant to push through adversity. His body was found face down in the snow, his skull cracked, not enough to kill him instantly, but enough to leave him confused, stumbling in the dark. Was it a fall or a blow? Thibeaux carried the weight of history on his shoulders. Born into a family branded as enemies of the people, he grew up under the shadow of Stalin's purges. His father had been sent to a Siberian labor camp, never to return. Despite his past, Thibeaux was known for his humor, inventiveness, and boundless energy. He had survived so much already, but the horrors of the Dyatlov Pass were something even he couldn't escape. When his body was found, his skull was completely crushed, as if something had slammed into him with impossible strength. Then there was Semyon, the outsider, the wild card, the 38-year-old veteran who wasn't supposed to be on this trip, but somehow ended up joining at the last minute. Semyon was single, covered in strange tattoos, and had a history that didn't quite add up. Now, his military records were murky, and his past was filled with gaps, but he had combat experience and classified training. He was found grinning in death, as if he faced his killer head-on. And decades later, when his body was exhumed, DNA tests couldn't even confirm he was who he claimed to be. Was Semyon just a hiker looking for adventure, or was he living under a false identity? And if so, was he the reason the group died? And finally, the survivor, Yuri Doroshenko, was supposed to be the 10th member of the group, but fate, or something else, spared him. His sciatic nerve flared up, forcing him to turn back early. Before he left, Lyudmila gave him a small stuffed bear, a parting gift he would keep until his dying day. For the rest of his life, Yuri lived with the unbearable weight of survivor's guilt, wondering what might have happened had he stayed. Would things have ended differently? Or was the fate of the Dyatlov 9 already sealed? 9 hikers entered the Dyatlov Pass. None of them made it out alive. Their deaths remain one of the most chilling and unexplained mysteries in modern history. But before we dive into what might have happened that fateful night, one thing is certain. These were not ordinary people. They were explorers, fighters, and dreamers. And something out there in the Ural Mountains made sure they never came home. Okay guys, settle in because this case is full of eerie details. Even though the Dyatlov Pass incident happened decades ago, we have an incredibly detailed timeline of events leading up to the group's mysterious deaths. Thanks to the meticulous diaries they kept, we can retrace their steps almost day by day. There was a group diary that all of them contributed to, And on top of that, both Lyudmila and Zina kept personal diaries, offering us an intimate look at their journey. We're going to summarize each day from these sources, but if you love diving into primary documents, the original diaries are available at dyatlovpass.com, a site I highly recommend checking out. The journey began on January 23, 1959, and the first diary entry came from Zina. The group is in a whirlwind of last-minute packing, ensuring they have everything they need for the expedition. The room is a chaotic mess. Zina calls it an artistic mess. Lyudmila is counting the money, as she's in charge of the finances. Meanwhile, Yuri Krivonishenko makes sure to pack his mandolin. Music will be a constant companion on their journey. Finally, they board the train in Sverdlovsk. The excitement is electric. They sing songs till 3 a.m. In her diary, Zina writes a haunting line. "I wonder what awaits us on this trip. I wonder what we will encounter." Reading that now, knowing what happened, it feels like chilling foreshadowing. Lyudmila also writes about their departure. She describes the rush of final preparations, running last-minute errands, and the brief but heartfelt goodbyes at the station. The group isn't traveling alone at first. They're accompanied by another hiking team, the Brignolles group. Everyone is in good spirits, singing together throughout the night. This is also when Semyon, the mysterious newcomer, joins them. Lyudmila notes that initially no one wanted him to join because he was a stranger, but ultimately they couldn't refuse. He quickly becomes part of the group, teaching them new songs. Now they are 10. Yuri Doroshenko, the only member who would survive, wrote the diary entry for January 24th. They arrive in Serov, still traveling with the Brignolles group. He notes that the Brignolles team brought hunting equipment, possibly weapons. Was he concerned? Was he just observing? Hard to say, but the detail does stand out. At the Serov train station, things go sideways. Communist-era police are naturally suspicious of groups of young people, and their presence attracts unwanted attention. Yuri Krivonishenko starts singing, only to be reprimanded by a sergeant who warns that disturbing other passengers is forbidden. But Lyudmila's personal diary tells a different, wilder version of events. She writes that the boys were teasing her for being stingy with money. In response, Yuri Krivonishenko starts passing a hat around the station after singing a song, essentially busking for fun. The police didn't find it amusing. He was arrested, and the group had to intervene to get him released. Adding to their troubles, they aren't allowed inside the station with their backpacks, forcing them to wait outside in the cold. After rescuing Yuri Krivonishenko, they kill time at a nearby school, where they're warmly welcomed. They speak to local children about hiking and their adventure, and the kids are fascinated, reluctant to let them leave when it's time to go. Back on the train that night, heading to Ivdel, there was another disturbance. A drunken man accused them of stealing his vodka. The police are called again, but the matter is resolved quickly. Meanwhile, both Zina and Lyudmila note in their diaries that the ride on the train is filled with passionate discussions about love and relationships. Voices rise as each person argues their perspective, shouting over one another. They're like teenagers, away from home, excited for adventure and full of life. Both groups arrive in Ivdel around midnight and bunked at the station, with a few people staying awake to watch over their belongings while the others slept. The plan was to catch the earliest bus to the town of Vizhay the next morning. Lyudmila confided that a guy named Zenya from the Brignolles group had been picking on her, saying offensive things. She blamed herself, thinking she had somehow added fuel to the fire. Semyon, the newest member of the group, was mentioned in Zina's diary. She wrote that he was a senior instructor at the Kharov Sport Base, and she was happy that he had been teaching them new songs. She noted that she felt a little sad, but brushed it off, writing that it was nothing. It's unclear what might have been on her mind, but she felt it was important enough to put in her diary. The night passed quickly at the station as the group rested, unaware of the challenges that lay ahead. Sasha wrote the January 25th diary entry. They woke up at 5:30 a.m. to catch a 25-seat bus packed with 20 hikers and their gear. It's an uncomfortable ride, with people perched on top of backpacks and skis, but no one seems to mind. They're too excited for the adventure ahead. At one point, the bus makes a detour, allowing them to stretch their legs. Lydia describes how, upon stepping out, they playfully throw themselves into the snow, reveling in the moment. But a minor mishap occurs. 4 members wander off to see a nearby power station and nearly miss the bus when it departs. They sprint after it, barely managing to reboard at the next stop. Lydia notes that all the singing has left her voiceless, and Zenya from the Blinov group keeps teasing her. To me, it sounds like he might have a crush on her, but doesn't know how to respond. Meanwhile, he seems to get along better with Zina because they're singing songs together. As the bus ride stretches on, the conversation turns philosophical. What is happiness? They debate the definition, but fail to reach a consensus. They arrive at Vizhay at 2 p.m. and part ways with the Blinov group. Lydia describes the farewell as emotional, with tears shed. The mood turns somber. That evening, they visit a familiar club from a previous trip, have dinner, and check into their accommodations, described as a simple hut with 3 windows. Zina notes that the group spends the evening in discussion, talking about love, friendship, and dreams for the future. Later, they hear that a favorite film, Symphony in Gold, is playing at the cinema. All but 2 of them rush to see it. Lydia, sitting next to Yuri Krivonishenko, watches him enjoy the film so much that he smacks his lips with delight. She writes, "This is real happiness, so difficult to describe with words." After the movie, the group's spirits are lifted. Igor, usually the serious leader, is suddenly dancing and singing. The night ends with dinner, more passionate discussions, this time about gender roles and freedom, and a cramped sleeping arrangement, 2 per bed, with Sasha and Yuri Krivonishenko on the floor. Yuri Krivonishenko was the author for the January 26th diary entry. They woke to a frigid morning, minus 17 degrees Celsius. The firewood was too damp to boil water, so they settled for lukewarm tea. Igor made a joke, saying if the tea is cold, drink it outside, then it will feel hot. By afternoon, they hitch a ride in a truck to their next stop, Settlement 41. It's an unbearably cold ride in the open truck bed, but they pass the time as they always do, singing and debating big ideas. Zina and Lydia both mention a striking character they meet at Settlement 41, Beard. He's a geologist with a long red beard and a captivating intellect. Lydia describes him as rare and charming. Zina notes his ginger hair and brown eyes in a way that suggests a crush. That night, the group sleeps in the settlement's hostel. Lydia, sharing a spring bed with Zina, writes, "Mood is bad and probably will be for 2 more days, evil as hell." But why would she write that? Is it the cold, the exhaustion, or something more? As they prepare to leave the last traces of civilization behind, the carefree energy of the trip begins to shift. Something is changing. The group diary entry for January 27th was written by Yuri Doroshenko. The weather was on their side, clear skies and a wind at their backs as they struck a deal with some locals. A horse would carry their heavy backpacks and equipment while they skied the 24-kilometer stretch to the abandoned settlement of Second North. While waiting to set out, the group jotted down some new songs they had learned from the locals. Among them were illegal prison songs, banned for their connection to counter-revolutionary crimes. These weren't just melodies, they were echoes of stories never meant to be told. Before they left, Beard gave Igor directions to a log house in Second North where they could stay. The entire settlement was a ghost town, empty and forgotten, except for whatever remnants of the past still lingered there. In the diary, Yuri complained that the horse carrying their supplies was painfully slow, but there was a silver lining. It was a relief to ski without the extra weight on their backs. Lydia made a brief note saying temperature is 5 degrees. Warm skis are useless. But more importantly, she acknowledged the gravity of their journey. They were leaving behind the last traces of civilization. Beyond the ghost town lay only the mountain. This was also the first day that Yuri Yudin mentioned falling ill. He had made it this far, but his worsening condition meant that he would have to turn back. At Second North, he would gather minerals for the university before parting ways with the group. By the time they arrived, the sky was black, the ghost town silent. But Beard's directions proved true, and they found the log house without issue. Yuri wrote that everything was well, and they spent the night talking and laughing, stretching the evening until 3 a.m. Zina's personal diary struck a more reflective tone, saying, "Today is the first day of our journey," almost as if everything before this moment had been preparation. She also noted Yuri Yudin's departure, calling it a pity, writing, "His sciatic nerve is inflamed again. Such a shame. We distributed his load in our backpacks." Lydia also mentioned learning some Mansi words from workers at Settlement 41. The Mansi, an indigenous people of the Ural Mountains, lived as hunters, fishermen, and reindeer herders, their nomadic existence tied to the land. They had their own culture, language, and traditions, but they were not considered a threat. On January 28th, the group awoke to the sound of raised voices. Yuri Krivonishenko and Thibeaux speaking in what Lydia described as rumbling voices. She didn't elaborate, but the wording suggested a low, heated conversation, maybe even an argument. If something was wrong, they didn't want the rest of the group to hear it. After breakfast, some of the group joined Yuri Yudin in his search for minerals, though they didn't find much. This was the last day with him, and Lydia wrote in the diary, "Yuri goes back home today. It is a pity, of course, that he leaves us, especially for me and Zina, but nothing can be done about it." Was she simply sad to lose a friend, or did she feel safer with him there? In Zina's personal diary, frustration seeped through. The boys had been making what she called stupid jokes. She hoped that by ignoring them, they would stop, but that didn't work. She was especially irritated when they were supposed to head out, but the guys were still wasting time digging through rocks with Yuri. Finally, at 11:45 a.m., they set off, following the river Losva. The terrain was flat, and they took turns leading the group every 10 minutes. The snow cover was lighter than expected, but wet, and it clung to the bottom of their skis, forcing them to stop and scrape it off. By 4 p.m., they paused for a late lunch. After another stretch of hiking, they stopped to rest at 5:30 p.m. on the banks of the river. That night, for the first time, they set up their tent. The guys worked on the stove and sewed curtains from sheets, making the space as comfortable as possible. After dinner, they lingered by the fire, singing songs that must have carried across the stillness of the forest. Zina even tried to learn the mandolin. They spoke about love, new ideas, and the future. Slowly, in pairs, they retreated to the tent for the night. All 9 of them squeezed into one tent, which must have been massive. The stove inside created a divide, one section for those closer to the heat and another for those further away. Lydia and Zina chose the colder side, because the heat wasn't exactly a luxury. No one wanted to sleep too close to the stove because it was scorching. Yuri Krivonishenko was assigned to the hot side, while Thibeaux, on duty, kept watch on the other. But Yuri Krivonishenko couldn't take the heat. After lying down for just a minute or two, he got up, cursing and accusing the others of treason. The outburst led to more arguing, although the diary didn't record exactly what was said or who was involved. Eventually, things settled and silence took over. Still, tensions simmered beneath the surface. The group was close, but arguments were becoming more frequent. Zina's personal diary held another troubling detail, writing, "We lay down to sleep. Igor was rude the whole evening. I just couldn't recognize him." Igor, their leader, their planner, the one who had been so excited for this expedition, was acting like someone else. What was bothering him? That night, she ended up sleeping on the wood near the stove. Thibeaux wrote the next group entry on January 29th, and it was strikingly brief. "Second day of our hike. We made our way from the Losva River to the Espia River. We walked along a Mansi trail. The weather is -13 Celsius. The wind is weak. We often find ice on the Losva River. That's all." It was a totally different type of diary entry than there had been before. Was the exhaustion settling in, or was something else weighing on the group? Zina's personal diary added a little more detail. It was Yuri Doroshenko's birthday, and they celebrated by giving him a tangerine. Small, but meaningful, and he shared it with the group. She noted that the trail they were following was well defined, with grooves and a clear path. Along the way, they saw Mansi signs carved into trees. She wondered what they meant, but the Mansi trail soon veered south while they continued on their intended route. Thibeaux also wrote the January 30th diary entry, saying the morning was -17 Celsius, the day -13 Celsius, and by night the temperature had plunged to -26 degrees Celsius. Snow had started to fall, the wind growing stronger from the southwest. The weather was shifting. He made an interesting note about the mansi. Their carved symbols told stories of the forests, the animals, resting places, and unknown warnings. He wanted to decipher them, to understand the hidden messages left behind. The deer trail they had been following ended, forcing them to trudge through untouched snow nearly 4 feet deep. The forest thinned as they climbed, but the river below was not yet frozen solid enough to walk on. That night, they set up camp, building a fire and pitching their tent on fir branches. In her last diary entry, Zina wrote, "We go to Aspia, cold. Mansi Trail ended. Pine forest. There was sun this morning. Now it's cold. All day we walked along the Aspia. We'll spend the night on Mansi Trail. Thibeaux didn't get to be a watchman, so me and Rustic will stay on duty tonight. Burned mittens and Yuri's quilted jacket. He cursed a lot. Today, probably we will build a storage." She didn't explain how the mittens and the jacket burned, or why Thibeaux wasn't on watch duty. Another argument, another unspoken tension? The final group diary entry on January 31st, 1959 was fittingly written by their leader, Igor. He wrote that the wind had picked up, but the sky remained clear. They followed a Mansi trail, noticing fresh deer hunter tracks. The hike was brutal. They barely covered a mile per hour. By late afternoon, they found a clearing with a forest platform above the ground and made the decision to store some of their supplies for the return trip. That night, they camped in exhaustion. Igor's last recorded words were almost poetic. "Can't imagine such comfort on the ridge, with howling wind outside, hundreds of kilometers away from human settlement." That was the last thing any of them would write. What happened next is only theory. On February 1st, the group likely set out late, covering only about 2.5 miles before stopping, unaware they had only hours left to live. By 5 p.m., they pitched their tent on the snowy slopes of Kolevatov, the mountain of the dead. They were just 10 miles from Mount Otorten, their planned final destination. Between 6 and 7 p.m., they ate their last meal together. Then, according to speculation, Semyon and Thibeaux left the tent to relieve themselves. What happened next remains one of the most chilling mysteries in history. By sunrise, all 9 hikers were dead. Before their departure, the group had agreed that Igor would send a telegram to the UPI Sports Club once they returned to Vizhay, no later than February 12th. But when Yuri Yudin had turned back from the group, Igor privately told him that the trek might take longer than expected. So when February 12th passed with no word, no alarms were raised. But panic set in by February 20th, because their families had waited too long without word. They demanded action. So the next day, a group of student volunteers formed the first search team and set out into the mountains along with planes assisting from the Ivdel airport. By the 22nd, the search party swelled in size as prison guards, police officers, Mansi hunters, and mountaineering specialists from Moscow joined the effort. The urgency in the air was palpable. Something was wrong, and nobody could sustain life in that temperature for very long. Because of the vast area they could be, a team was dropped near Mount Otorten, the hikers' intended final stop. What they found was even more unsettling, because the group had never made it there. But luckily, on February 25th, searchers stumbled onto their first clue, a ski trail that belonged to the missing hikers. They followed it step by step through the frozen wilderness. The next day, they saw it, half buried in the snow. The hikers' tent stood eerily still, abandoned and untouched. The tent rested on a flattened patch of snow. 8 pairs of skis were neatly stacked beneath it, used for insulation. Inside, 9 backpacks sat undisturbed, along with jackets, boots, socks, blankets, food, diaries, cameras, money, and documents. Nothing appeared stolen, nothing seemed out of place. Except for one thing. The tent had been sliced open from the inside. Instead of using the entrance, the hikers had cut their way out. More cuts inside suggested they had desperately tried to escape, and fast. Yet everything inside remained orderly, except one odd detail. All their footwear had been piled together in one place. Rescuers scanned the landscape. Scattered around the abandoned tent, they found puzzling remnants of the hikers' final moments. A pair of skis jutted out of the snow, forgotten and useless. An ice axe lay discarded nearby, as if dropped in haste. Even more baffling, a flashlight sat neatly on the surface, turned off, but still in perfect working condition. Was it left behind deliberately or simply overlooked in a moment of sheer panic? Then there was Igor's jacket, cast aside in the snow. Why would he remove it in such brutal cold? Had he abandoned it in desperation? Had something or someone forced him to flee so quickly that he didn't think to take it with him? But the most chilling discovery lay just beyond the tent. A trail of footprints, bare feet in the snow. The rescuers followed the fragile imprints, their unease growing with every step. Of the 9 hikers, only one had been wearing boots. The rest had run into the night half-dressed, in socks or completely barefoot, as if they had no time, no choice but to escape. And yet, despite 26 days exposed to the elements, the footprints were still there. The snowfall hadn't buried them. There'd been no storm, no blizzard to erase their path. The scene was frozen in time, waiting to be uncovered. By nightfall, the search team radioed for reinforcements. They still believed this was a rescue mission. By morning, they realized it wasn't. The next day, at 11 a.m., a searcher noticed something dark near a cedar tree, 1.5 kilometers from the tent. As they drew closer, the shape in the snow became clear. Yuri Doroshenko and Georgiy Krivonishenko lay sprawled in the snow, their bodies twisted unnaturally. They were nearly naked, dressed in only their underclothes, hardly enough to survive the brutal temperatures. Nearby, the remnants of a small fire flickered weakly, as if it had burned out long ago. Had they tried to warm themselves up? Yuri Doroshenko's hands were charred, his fingers burned as if he desperately tried to keep the fire alive. Georgiy Krivonishenko's right index finger was torn open, his hands covered in blood. Had he been fighting something, someone, or had he clawed at the frozen earth in a final hopeless attempt to survive? Under Yuri Doroshenko's body, several cedar branches had been cut and placed deliberately. But for what purpose? A makeshift bed, a barricade, a signal? The knife that had cut them was nowhere to be found. And then there were the trees. Some of the first around them had been cut high up, far higher than someone could easily reach. Someone had climbed them, but why? Were they looking for something or trying to escape? Scattered around the scene were torn scraps of clothing, wool socks, 8 rubles in cash, and no answers. A survival attempt or something else entirely? As the day wore on, the search party pressed further into the snow, dread settling over them like the coming night. About 1,100 meters from the tent, they found Igor. He lay on his back, frozen in time, his face turned toward the tent, as if he had been trying to crawl home. One arm was raised, bent at an angle that seemed almost defensive, as if shielding himself from something unseen. On his wrist, his watch had stopped at 5:31 a.m. Not far away, the search dogs led their handlers to another body, Zina. She too had been crawling toward the tent when death overtook her. Her body was twisted, contorted against the snow, her face and back streaked with scratches and blood. Her head was also facing the tent, and her skull was fractured. The rescuers began whispering among themselves. Maybe it had been the weather. Maybe an unrelenting wind had forced the hikers to flee. But when they checked the meteorological records, their unease turned to fear. The weather had been clear. No storms, no hurricane-force winds, nothing that should have driven them into the night, barefoot and terrified. And yet, 4 of them were dead, 5 more still missing, and the deeper they searched, the stranger the story became. The search continued, each day bringing more questions than answers. On March 2nd, searchers stumbled upon the group's storage site, a cache of supplies the hikers had left behind for their return journey. It was completely untouched. Food, extra clothing, gear, everything remained exactly as they had left it. Which meant one chilling thing. If any of the missing hikers had survived beyond that first night, they never came back for supplies. Whatever had driven them from the tent had kept them from returning. The next day, on March 3rd, investigators gathered at Ivdel Airport. Every item from the abandoned campsite was carefully laid out and inspected piece by piece. The conclusion was unsettling. Every single hiker had left the tent without their outer clothing. No thick coats, no insulated pants, no boots. In temperatures that could freeze exposed skin in minutes. They had fled into the night practically defenseless against the elements. No one in their right mind would do that. Unless something worse than the cold was inside that tent. And then there was the disturbing realization. Scattered among the supplies still in the tent were axes and knives, untouched, abandoned. Whatever they were running from, they hadn't even stopped to grab their weapons. On March 4th, autopsies were performed on the first 4 of the 9 hikers. Yuri Doroshenko, Yuri Krivonishenko, Igor, and Zina, which only deepened the mystery. Yuri Doroshenko was the first on the table. His skin was an unnatural brown purple, his body stiff from the cold. He wore only a sleeveless undershirt, a checked short-sleeved shirt buttoned to the top, shorts, and waterproof underpants. A strange outfit for sub-zero temperatures. Even stranger, his clothing told a story of struggle. His cotton underpants were badly torn, with a large hole on the right side and another inside his left thigh. He had mismatched wool socks, one of which was burned, but no shoes. Then came the chilling detail. His body had been moved. Livor mortis, the pooling of blood after death, was found on his back, neck, and limbs, but he had been discovered face down. That meant someone or something had shifted his body before his blood had fully settled. His injuries were grotesque. The right side of his hair was singed. His ear, nose, and lips were coated in blood. A dark red hemorrhage swelled his upper lip. A gray foam leaked from his right cheek and open mouth, which is a sign of pulmonary edema, common in pressure-induced suffocation. His right shoulder had abrasions and cuts. His right forearm and armpit were deeply bruised. His hands and feet were frostbitten beyond recognition. Most disturbingly, he had far more urine in his bladder than expected for a hypothermia victim, a sign that there was something else at play. And then there was the gray foam. Had someone or something pressed down on his chest, forcing the air from his lungs? The KGB and Stalin's secret police were known to use this suffocation method during interrogations. Yet the official cause of death? Hypothermia. Like Yuri Doroshenko, Yuri Krivonishenko was severely underdressed. He wore only an undershirt, a long-sleeved checkered shirt, waterproof swimming trunks, long underpants, and one torn sock. His injuries painted a far more gruesome picture. He had deep bruises covering his forehead. Blood seeped from his right temple. His left cheek was bruised, and his ears frostbitten. His fingertips were blackened from frostbite. His right palm bore a jagged dark brown wound, surrounded by cuts with charred edges, as if he had grabbed something burning. The tip of his nose was missing. No blood, no signs of struggle. Investigators assumed an animal had gnawed it off after death. But inside his mouth, they found something horrifying. A piece of his own skin. Had he bitten it off himself in agony, or had he been trying to stifle a scream? His left hip bore 3 deep linear wounds, clean-edged, deliberate. His legs were streaked with abrasions and burns, and the skin on his left foot was peeling, his toe charred. Yet, despite his mutilated state, the official cause of death? Again, hypothermia. Igor was found lying in the snow, his hands clenched into fists, frozen above his chest. His skin was bluish red. Unlike the others, he had tried to stay warm. He wore a sleeveless fur vest, a blue sweater, a long-sleeve cotton red shirt, and a sleeveless cotton singlet. In his shirt pocket were 4 streptocide pills used for treating infected wounds. He had also taken clothing from Yuri Doroshenko, stripping the dead to survive. His fur vest and long-sleeved shirt had originally belonged to Doroshenko. Still, he had no shoes, only mismatched socks. His body looked like he struggled. He had cuts on his forehead, eyelids, and cheeks, dried blood on his lips, bruised knees and ankles, a deep incision on his right shin, numerous scratches on his hands and forearms, wounds typical of hand-to-hand combat, and bruises on his knuckles, as if he fought back. Had Igor tried to resist whatever forced them from the tent? Or had he fought his own friends in the desperate battle to stay alive? Zina was last on the autopsy table. She was dressed better than the others, wearing 2 hats, multiple sweaters, a checkered shirt, and ski pants. She had 3 pairs of socks, but no shoes. In her pocket, 5 rubles and a military-style protective mask. Investigators examined her body for signs of sexual activity. The results were negative. Her injuries, however, told a story of violence. She had a cut on her forehead, a grayish wound above her eyebrow, dark abrasions on her eyelids, a red scrape on her nose, bruises on her cheeks and face, a deep, jagged wound on her right hand, and severe frostbite on her fingers. Like Igor, her hands bore injuries from combat. Had she too fought against whatever attacked them? And then, something chilling. A long, bright red bruise stretched across her torso. The shape and impact pattern matched a baton strike, but no baton was ever found. Her official cause of death? Hypothermia, due to a violent accident. Almost as if the examiners knew something beyond the cold had played a role in her death, but had no way to explain it. The autopsies revealed wounds too severe to be caused by the elements alone, yet none were considered fatal. The victims were badly beaten, frostbitten, and possibly suffocated. Some had burns, missing flesh, and unexplained bruises. Their bodies had been moved and stripped after death. Had they suffered paradoxal undressing, a symptom of late-stage hypothermia? No, the evidence was clear. Their clothes had been removed by other members of the group after they died. And there were still 5 more bodies waiting to be found. The mystery was only beginning. On March 5th, searchers made another grim discovery: Rustic. He was lying face down, partially buried beneath 50 centimeters or about 20 inches of snow, just 480 meters from the cedar tree. His left hand was outstretched, frozen in a desperate crawl, as if he had been trying to escape something. The most chilling detail? Beneath his body, searchers found an ice bed. This meant that, unlike the others, Rustic had still been alive when he collapsed. His body had radiated warmth long enough to melt the snow beneath him before he succumbed to the elements. When he died, the melted snow refroze, trapping him in place, his final moments preserved in ice. On his wrist, a watch had stopped at 8:45 a.m., as if marking the exact moment he slipped away. His face, eerily calm, bore no immediate signs of struggle, but that illusion of peace would not last long. By March 8th, Rustic lay on the autopsy table. Unlike the others, he was better dressed, layered in a long-sleeve undershirt, a shirt, a sweater, 2 pairs of pants, and 4 pairs of socks. He wore a single felt boot on his right foot. Hidden under his sweater were 2 shoe insoles. His pockets held 310 rubles, his passport, a small folding knife, a pencil, a pen, a plastic-sleeved comb, and a box of matches with 48 sticks. He had even carried an extra cotton sock. But for all of his preparedness, none of it had saved him. Rustic's injuries weren't those of someone who simply froze to death. They were the wounds of a man who had been brutally beaten. His skull was fractured from his forehead to the top of his head, likely from a powerful blow with a blunt object. There were hemorrhages at his temples, deep abrasions and scratches across his forehead, bruises on his upper eyelid, and a bloody nose. His face was swollen, battered from both sides. His hands bore the telltale injuries of a fight: bruised knuckles, torn skin. His lips were swollen. His arms, palms, and even his shins were bruised. The skin on his right forearm had been ripped away. And yet, despite the brutal injuries, the official cause of death? Hypothermia. Even more unsettling, medical examiners ruled Rustic as the first of the group to die. But if he was the first, what or who inflicted these injuries? And why did no one else show signs of the same violent attack? Whatever happened in those final moments, Rustic's frozen, outstretched hand seemed to tell a silent, unanswered question. What was he trying to escape? On May 5th, a Mansi native and his dog followed an unusual trail, branches cut clean as if marking a path. Something had been left behind. 50 meters from the cedar tree, they found a pair of black cotton sweatpants. The right leg had been cut off with a knife. Nearby, half a woman's light brown wool sweater lay in the snow, its sleeves severed. Someone had been here. Someone had tried to survive. The Mansi hunter alerted the search teams, who began digging into a nearby snowdrift. At a depth of 3.5 meters, they unearthed a grim collection of items. A severed leg of black ski trousers, a thick brown wool sweater, a white wool jumper, and a pair of brown trousers tied at the ankles but flared open, ripped wider. Had the last 4 victims been trying to build a shelter? A desperate attempt to wait for rescue? Then, about 50 meters from the cedar tree, the searchers reached the stream, and there they found them. 3 men and 1 woman. The woman was instantly recognizable, Lyudmila, but the men, their faces were unidentifiable in the water's grasp. Lyudmila's body was positioned facing upstream. She was dressed in layers, small skull cap, yellow sleeveless shirt, flannel shirt, gray sweater, and another dark sweater. Her legs were covered in brown ski trousers and leggings. On one foot, 2 wool socks. On the other, half of a beige sweater wrapped around like a makeshift shoe. But the most horrifying discovery? Her tongue was missing. She was on her knees, her head resting on a natural ledge as the water flowed over her, arms raised, mouth open, as if caught in a final silent scream. The first man, later identified as Thibeaux, was found wearing a khaki windbreaker. On his wrist, 2 watches. One had stopped at 8:38 a.m., the other at 8:15 a.m. Time had frozen for him, twice. The other 2, Sasha and Semyon, were locked in an eerie embrace, one lying against the other, breast to back, as if Sasha had been trying to warn Semyon in their final moments. They had no head coverings, and disturbingly, patches of their hair were missing. Semyon still had a camera around his neck. In one hand, he clutched a pen, in the other, a small notepad, but the pages were blank. Had he tried to write down what happened? Had he realized too late that he was dying? That whatever horror had unfolded would remain forever unwritten? Once the bodies were recovered, the rescuers prepared for transport. They placed them on stretchers, dragged them through the snow toward the helipad. But when they arrived, something unexpected happened. The pilot refused to take the bodies. They claimed it was outside their official duties. But why? A chilling theory emerged. The pilots already knew the bodies had radiation poisoning. The medical examiner refused to conduct any examinations on site, and even after the bodies were packed and ready, the helicopter crew still refused to transport them unless they were sealed in zinc coffins. Only after an intervention from the medical examiner were they finally airlifted to Ivdel for autopsy. But why the hesitation? What were the pilots afraid of? And what had really happened to the last 4 victims of Dyatlov Pass? The last 4 were finally autopsied on May 9th. Unlike the others, we know they lived longer. The proof was in the clothes. They had stripped the bodies of their fallen friends to survive. And then there was the brown sweater Lyudmila had been wearing. It belonged to Yuri Krivonishenko, and it would later test radioactive. Now that in itself should have been a massive red flag. How had their clothing become radioactive out in the middle of nowhere? And could that have been what killed them? But the real horror was what had happened to Lyudmila's body. Her eyes were gone, not just missing. Her eye sockets were completely empty. The soft tissue around them, her eyebrows, her nose bridge, gone. The left side of her cheek was stripped to the bone. Her tongue had been torn from her mouth. But here's the disturbing part. She had suffered massive internal injuries. 4 broken ribs, 2 fractures, a hemorrhage in her heart's right atrium, and in her stomach, 100 grams of a dark brown mass. Her heart was still beating when her tongue was removed. Blood had still been flowing, and she had been alive. Her cause of death? Hemorrhage into the right atrium of her heart, multiple fractured ribs, internal bleeding. For the first time, examiners didn't list hypothermia as the cause of death. Semyon had been dressed for survival. 2 hats, a scarf, a black sweater, a long coat, 2 pairs of pants, ski trousers, and in his pockets, coins, newspapers, and a compass. But the most bizarre find, a 5th camera. Yuri Yudin said the group only had 4 cameras with them. This one had never been accounted for, and whatever was on it, lost forever. The film had been completely destroyed by water. Could he have documented the final moments of the group? If so, the answers were washed away before anyone could see them. He was found with a pen in one hand, a notepad in the other, as if he had been about to write something but died before he could. And like Lyudya, his body had suffered unimaginable trauma. His eyeballs were missing. His skull had an open wound exposing the bone, 5 broken ribs, 2 fractures. Both he and Lyudya had hemorrhaging in the cardiac muscle, meaning they were alive when their injuries happened. The injuries were eerily similar to the kind of damage caused by the shockwave of a bomb. Lyudya likely lived for 10 to 20 minutes after her injuries. Semyon, even longer. Sasha was also one of the better-dressed hikers, layers upon layers, enough that he probably wasn't freezing to death. His ski jacket, though, had strange damage. A large hole in the left sleeve, multiple tears in the right, and burn marks along the edges. His waistband and the lower parts of his pants later tested radioactive. Like the others, his eyebrows were missing. His skull was exposed. The bridge of his nose appeared intact, but the cartilage underneath had unusual mobility. His nostrils had been flattened, a snapped neck, and a blow behind the ear. A signature kill used by special forces. Thibeaux, too, had been wrapped in heavy clothing. 2 hats, a fur-lined coat, thick wool gloves in his pocket, 2 pairs of pants, ski trousers. On his feet, hand-knitted socks and thick felt boots. And on his wrist, the 2 watches. But his injuries were catastrophic. His skull was shattered, fractures so severe that one conclusion was that he had fallen from a rock. Another, the trauma matched the impact of being hit by an automobile moving at high speed. Yet he didn't die immediately. He may have been unconscious for 2 to 3 hours after the injury. On May 11th, Lyudya, Sasha, and Semyon were buried. The next day, they laid Thibeaux to rest. But here's where it gets really suspicious. Their autopsy reports weren't released for 30 to 40 years. For decades, the official story was that all the hikers had died from hypothermia. What were the authorities hiding? And why were these 4 buried in a closed coffin? In Russia, it's tradition to have open casket funerals, just like they did for the others. So what was the official word? The official cause of death? An overwhelming force the hikers could not overcome, with no explanation of what that force was. The case was closed, blaming the deaths on a series of mistakes made by Igor on February 1st, 1959. In 1962, a monument was erected in the cemetery with photos of the entire group, and from that point on, the site of their mysterious deaths became known as Dyatlov Pass. The tragedy lingered in the shadows, whispered about, but never officially reopened until April 13, 2018. For years, no official records confirmed that Semyon's remains were actually buried at his gravesite. His relatives, determined to uncover the truth, requested an exhumation. Inside the grave, the coffin had disintegrated. His clothing had vanished, leaving behind only 2 buttons and the soles of his shoes. His skeleton was intact, but something was off. His front tooth was missing, a detail never mentioned in his original autopsy. Forensic tests confirmed the remains belonged to a 35 to 40-year-old male, a smoker. But was it truly Semyon? DNA was sent for analysis to determine if the man buried there had any genetic link to Semyon's family. The results were shocking. Despite appearing identical to the photos of Semyon taken during the trek, the DNA did not match his relatives. A second test was conducted. This time, the results suggested a near 100 probability of kinship. But there was a catch. It raised the possibility that the man in the grave wasn't actually Semyon, but instead his long-lost brother, a man who had reportedly collaborated with the Germans during World War II before disappearing without a trace. People wanted to reopen the case as a criminal investigation, but in August 2018, authorities refused and instead claimed their deaths were due to panic that was triggered by an avalanche. Then, in September 2018, the case was partially reopened, but not as a criminal case. Instead, investigators were tasked with determining which one of 75 possible natural causes had killed the group. Among the options, avalanches, snow slabs, hurricane-force winds, and even alien intervention. In the end, they chose to focus on just 3: avalanche, snow slab, or powerful snowstorm. This case is packed with so many wild theories that covering them all would be impossible. So let's dive into some of the most intriguing ones. Avalanche is the explanation that the government insists on, but honestly, it doesn't add up. There's no history of avalanches in that area. The slope wasn't steep, and most importantly, there was no actual evidence of an avalanche. Some of the bodies weren't even covered in the snow. The footprints from the tent showed them walking calmly down the hill, not running in terror. If an avalanche had hit, wouldn't they have fled in a panic? And if snow had collapsed the tent, why cut their way out instead of digging through? And here's the kicker. There's no record of extreme weather at Dyatlov Pass that night. Now, a phenomenon that many locals believe in is ball lightning. This theory has a little more weight because the indigenous Mansi people who have lived in the region for centuries believe this is what happened. Ball lightning is an unexplained atmospheric phenomenon where orbs of energy streak across the sky, burning everything in their path. It could explain why the group left the tent so suddenly, but didn't sprint. Maybe they were trying to stay calm, not knowing where the next strike would hit. It could also explain the burns on the bodies, the damage to the cedar tree, and why some of the hikers' injuries looked like they'd been hit by an explosion. Now my next theory is eerie. Infrasound is a low-frequency vibration that humans can't hear, but it can cause disorientation, fear, and even hallucination. Some researchers believe strong winds passing through the mountain's unique terrain could have generated these sound waves, triggering a sense of sheer terror in the hikers. Looking at their diary entries, tension was rising within the group as they neared the mountain. Maybe it was the stress of the trip, or maybe it was something else. Could infrasound have driven them into a panic, causing them to flee into the night in a state of delirium? What about an animal attack? Most animals would not attack a group of 9 people, but there are some possibilities. A herd of reindeer. Maybe they trampled the tent, spooking the hikers, but that would not explain the brutal injuries. A wolverine. These guys were only 20 to 40 pounds, but they are ferocious, capable of taking down a bear. If one had caught the scent of food, it might have tried to get into the tent, causing the hikers to cut their way out in a panic. But a wolverine attack wouldn't explain anything else. A yeti. Okay, it's out there, but it would explain why the injuries look like they were caused by something inhumanly strong. What about a government cover-up? Now we're getting into the real conspiracy theories. Some believe the hikers were accidentally killed during a secret weapons test, and the government staged the scene. Others think they stumbled upon a classified military operation, and they were eliminated to keep it secret. Or maybe they were the mission, involved in something they weren't meant to survive. One of the biggest red flags? Yuri Doroshenko, the sole survivor who left early, never spoke much about what happened. He even had to sign a military secrecy agreement. Why would that be necessary if it was just an avalanche? And let's just say it. Was it a UFO? Aliens? We are not alone. Witnesses reported glowing, pulsating lights in the sky over Dyatlov Pass on the night of February 1st. If extraterrestrials did show up, what did they do to the hikers? The Mansi people had been drawing strange flying objects for generations. So was this an isolated incident, or has something been lurking in these mountains for centuries? What really happened? Well, I'd like to believe it was aliens, but I can't prove it. Yuri Yudin, the only survivor, always believed the group died because of secret military tests. He wasn't alone in that suspicion, but with the Russian government still refusing to investigate, do you think we'll ever know the truth? So, let's say you're thinking about hiking in the Ural Mountains. Sounds epic, right? Snow-covered peaks, dense forests, untouched wilderness, and of course, one of the most famous unsolved mysteries in history. But before you go full explorer mode, let's talk about something that could literally save your life. Staying safe. Because if history has taught us anything about the Urals, it's that you do not want to be caught unprepared. The Ural Mountains are no joke. We're talking about a place where the weather can turn instantly, where cell service is basically non-existent, and where help is hours, if not days, away. So, first things first. Plan your route, tell someone your plan, and watch the weather. Step 2. Pack like your life depends on it, because it just might. Here's what you need. Navigation tools, including a physical map and compass, clothing that works for all conditions, an emergency kit, food, and water. Step 3. Watch for hazards. Wild animals like bears and wolves exist out there, but encounters are rare. Be careful of river crossings because they're super easy to underestimate. So test the depth first, because getting swept away by icy water is not a fun way to go. And avalanches. They happen, although not so sure that's what happened in Dyatlov Pass. Before you go, know the signs, carry an avalanche beacon, and for the love of everything, don't camp in a risky spot. Step 4. Don't go solo. Hiking alone in the Urals is a bold choice, but not a smart one. Always go with a group. And don't count on your phone saving you. There's zero cell service in most areas. Step 5. If something goes wrong, don't make it worse. What I mean is that if you're lost, stay put. Wandering burns energy and makes you harder to find. If you're injured, keep warm and stay still. Shock and hypothermia set in fast. And finally, respect the land and the legends. The Urals aren't just another hiking destination. They're steeped in history, mystery, and deep cultural significance. Leave no trace, take nothing, leave nothing, and don't mess with sacred Mansi sites. Also, listen to local warnings. If the locals say a place is cursed, maybe, just maybe, don't camp there. So here we are, decades later, countless theories, investigations reopened and closed again. And we still don't have a definitive answer. 9 experienced hikers found scattered across the mountain, some with horrifying injuries, some frozen mid-escape, their tent slashed from the inside, their bodies telling stories that don't quite add up. An avalanche? Maybe. A secret government experiment gone wrong? Possibly. Something else? Something we can't explain? Well, that's the part that keeps people up at night. Whatever happened on that frozen slope in 1959, one thing is certain. Those 9 hikers encountered something so terrifying, so powerful, that they fled into the deadly cold without hesitation. And we may never truly know why, because some mysteries never really rest. And finally, remember to leave a review and rate this podcast 5 stars if you like the show, or hell, even if you don't. But either way, feel free to let me know what you think. Please follow The Last Trip on Instagram at The Last Trip Crime Pod and subscribe on Patreon to support the show. You'll get extra research, videos, photos, and updates, and even learn more about my personal travels. That's patreon.com/lasttrippodcast. I'm Jamie Beebe, bringing you your last trip and signing off until the next one. Thanks for listening.